In September 1941, more than 450,000 soldiers vanished around one city that was ordered to never retreat. Kyiv was defended, fortified, and sacrificed while German armor closed in from hundreds of kilometers away. Why did one political decision turn an entire front into the largest encirclement of the war? By the summer of 1941, the strategic balance in Eastern Europe had been shaped by 2 years of unstable coexistence between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. The agreement temporarily secured Germany's eastern flank while the Soviet Union expanded westward into eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. This territorial expansion brought the Soviet border hundreds of kilometers closer to the German sphere of influence in Central Europe, fundamentally altering the military geometry of the region. By late 1940, German leadership had already abandoned the concept of long-term cooperation with Moscow and finalized plans for a war of annihilation in the East. On 18 December 1940, Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 21, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, ordering the destruction of Soviet military power in a single campaign lasting no more than 5 months. Germany's strategic objectives combined ideological, economic, and military calculations. Ukraine and Kyiv in particular represented a key prize. The Ukrainian SSR supplied a substantial share of Soviet agricultural output, coal from the Donbass, and industrial capacity along the Dnieper basin. The capture of Kyiv would also open routes toward the Caucasus and sever major Soviet north-south communications. For the Soviet Union, the southwestern direction was one of the most heavily fortified sectors before the war. The Kyiv Special Military District, later reorganized into the Southwestern Front, was responsible for defending Ukraine. By June 1941, the Southwestern Front deployed approximately 900,000 personnel, supported by over 5,500 tanks and nearly 3,500 aircraft, according to official strength reports. These figures, however, masked severe structural weaknesses. Many units were still in the process of reorganization following the creation of new mechanized corps in 1940-1941. Command cadres had been disrupted by the purges of 1937-1938. Communication systems remained vulnerable, and forward troops were deployed in exposed salients close to the border rather than in depth. German forces concentrated against Ukraine were organized under Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. At the start of the invasion, the group included roughly 57 divisions: the German 6th Army, 17th Army, 1st Panzer Group, and Allied Romanian formations on the southern flank. Total German and Allied strength in the southern sector exceeded 1,000 personnel, supported by approximately 1,000 tanks and over 2,300 operational aircraft. Their operational concept emphasized deep armored thrusts, supported by continuous air interdiction and rapid infantry follow-up. Public sentiment in Kyiv in June 1941 reflected a complex mixture of official propaganda, wartime mobilization, and reactions to recent Soviet policies. The city had undergone intense industrialization in the 1930s and severe political repression. The memory of the famine of 1932-1933 and mass arrests during the purges remained present within civilian society. At the same time, the Soviet state projected confidence in its military power. On 21 June 1941, no public warning was issued of an imminent German attack. Civil defense preparations remained largely routine. At dawn, on 22 June 1941, German forces launched their invasion across the entire length of the Soviet western border. In the first week of fighting, Soviet border armies in Ukraine absorbed the full shock of German mobile warfare. By early July, large tank battles west of the Dnieper had resulted in the loss of thousands of Soviet armored vehicles. The collapse of the border defense forced a rapid reorganization of the Southwestern Front under extreme pressure. Despite these early defeats, Soviet High Command continued to view Kyiv as a politically and strategically essential strongpoint. Directives issued in early July emphasized holding the city at all costs and retaining control of the Dnieper crossings. This decision would define all subsequent operational choices in the region. By mid-July 1941, the defense of Kyiv was no longer a regional objective, but a central element of Soviet strategy in the southern half of the front. The conditions for a prolonged battle, followed by one of the largest encirclements of the Second World War, were already in place. On 22 June 1941, at 04 local time, German artillery and airstrikes struck Soviet positions along the entire western frontier. In the southwestern sector, units of Army Group South crossed into Ukrainian territory, with the forces of the 6th Army advancing through Volhynia, while the 1st Panzer Group executed deep armored penetrations south of Lutsk and Dubno. Within the first 24 hours, the Luftwaffe conducted more than 1,600 combat sorties in the southern operational zone alone. Soviet aviation losses in the Kyiv Special Military District during the opening 2 days are estimated at 1,000 to 1,200 aircraft destroyed, most of them on the ground. The Soviet 5th, 6th, 12th, and 26th Armies formed the first operational shield of the southwestern front. These forces were positioned close to the border in forward deployment zones, as dictated by pre-war Soviet doctrine that emphasized immediate counteroffensive action rather than elastic defense. When German forces attacked, many Soviet formations were still in transit to assigned defensive sectors. Artillery units lacked prepared firing positions, and field headquarters were often located in peacetime facilities vulnerable to air attack. As German airstrikes disrupted telephone lines and radio relays, front-level coordination began to deteriorate within the first 12 hours. Between 23 and 30 June 1941, one of the largest early armored engagements of the war unfolded in the triangle between Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody. 5 Soviet mechanized corps, fielding more than 2,500 tanks on paper, launched counterattacks against the advancing German Panzer Corps. German armored strength in the sector totaled approximately 750 operational tanks. Despite numerical superiority, Soviet tank forces suffered catastrophic losses due to mechanical failures, fuel shortages, inadequate coordination with infantry, and constant air interdiction. By the end of June, more than 60% of Soviet armored vehicles involved were destroyed or abandoned. The failure of these counterattacks opened the operational depth leading toward the Dnieper. On 1 July, German forward units crossed the Horen River. By 7 July, elements of the 1st Panzer Group reached Zhytomyr, cutting major east-west supply routes supporting the southwestern front. At the same time, infantry divisions of the German 6th Army advanced steadily behind the armored spearheads, eliminating bypass Soviet units and securing captured road networks. Soviet attempts to stabilize defensive lines along secondary rivers, such as the Sluch and Taterev, collapsed within days due to insufficient reserves and disrupted logistics. On 10 July 1941, Soviet High Command replaced the original commander of the Southwestern Front with Marshal Semyon Budyonny, reflecting growing concern over the scale of the defeat. Budyonny assumed control of approximately 900,000 troops still nominally assigned to the front, although actual combat-ready strength was significantly lower due to losses and unit disintegration. Orders issued during this period emphasized the defense of the Dnieper Line and the retention of Kyiv as a major urban strongpoint. By mid-July, German armored columns had reached the western approaches to the Dnieper north and south of Kyiv. Forward reconnaissance units probed toward the river crossings at Cherkasy, Kanev, and the northern bend near Oster. Soviet forces began preparing defensive fortifications inside the Kyiv fortified region, a pre-war system of bunkers and artillery positions originally designed in the 1930s. Civilian mobilization for trench digging and obstacle construction expanded rapidly. Throughout the second half of July, air raids on Kyiv intensified. Between 15 and 31 July, German aircraft conducted more than 600 bombing sorties against rail yards, bridges, factories, and power stations inside the city. Civilian casualties mounted steadily, though precise figures for this phase remain fragmentary. Evacuation of industrial equipment and administrative institutions toward the east began under air attack and rail congestion. By the end of July 1941, The opening phase of the battle for Kyiv had concluded. German forces had penetrated deep into central Ukraine. The Red Army had failed to stop the advance west of the Dnieper. The defense of Kyiv now shifted from mobile maneuver warfare to a positional struggle centered on river crossings, fortified zones, and the growing tension between operational retreat and political orders to hold the city. By the beginning of August 1941, both German and Soviet high commands had clarified their strategic priorities in the southern sector. For the German leadership, the initial expectation of a rapid destruction of Soviet forces west of the Dnieper had only been partially realized. Although major Soviet tank formations had been defeated near Dubno and Brody, large Soviet field armies remained intact behind the river line, with Kyiv acting as the central operational anchor. German strategic planning therefore shifted toward a dual objective: securing the Dnieper crossings while preparing conditions for a large encirclement of the southwestern front. Within the German High Command, a major strategic debate unfolded during late July and early August. Adolf Hitler increasingly emphasized the economic and political importance of Ukraine and demanded the destruction of Soviet forces in this region before any renewed drive toward Moscow. In contrast, elements of the German Army High Command argued that armored forces should be concentrated exclusively for a central push toward the Soviet capital. This disagreement resulted in a temporary redistribution of forces. On 30th of July, orders were issued for the 2nd Panzer Group, operating under Army Group Center, to begin preparations for a potential southern redeployment toward the Desna and the rear of the southwestern front. Although the movement was not carried out immediately, it signaled the growing importance assigned to a decisive operation against Kyiv. Army Group South, meanwhile, focused on consolidating its bridgeheads on the western bank of the Dnieper and maintaining pressure along the river line. The German 6th Army positioned itself north of Kyiv, while the 17th Army advanced south of the city. The 1st Panzer Group remained the primary mobile striking force, tasked with maintaining operational depth and responding to Soviet counter-movements. By early August, German logistical lines extended more than 500 kilometers from the original border, creating growing dependence on rail conversion units and captured Soviet rolling stock. Daily fuel consumption in the southern sector exceeded 3,000 cubic meters, placing sustained strain on German supply capacity. On the Soviet side, strategic planning around Kyiv became increasingly constrained by political directives. The city was not only a major industrial and transportation hub, but also a symbol of Soviet authority in Ukraine. On 29 July, the Soviet State Defense Committee reinforced earlier orders stating that Kyiv was to be held regardless of operational difficulties. Marshal Bodiani and the Southwestern Front Command were instructed to stabilize the Dnieper line and prevent any German crossing east of the river. At this stage, the Southwestern Front still fielded approximately 700,000 to 750,000 personnel, though large portions of these forces had suffered heavy equipment losses. Tank strength had declined to fewer than 1,500 operational vehicles, and aircraft availability was reduced to approximately 900 combat-capable machines. Soviet logistics faced mounting crisis conditions. Rail lines feeding Kyiv from the east were subjected to continuous German air interdiction. Between 1 and 10th of August, more than 40 key rail bridges east of the city were damaged or destroyed. Ammunition and fuel deliveries were frequently delayed for days. Artillery units inside the Kyiv fortified region were forced to ration fire to pre-planned defensive sectors only. Infantry formations increasingly relied on local food requisition to sustain rations, as organized supply convoys could not meet daily demand. German operational planning for August emphasized probing attacks rather than immediate full-scale assault on the city. Reconnaissance elements tested Soviet defensive cohesion along the Irpin and Desna River approaches, while artillery groups conducted registration fire against known bunker positions. Luftwaffe formations focused on suppressing river crossings, rail junctions, and evacuation routes. Between 1 and 15 August, German air forces flew over 1,200 sorties against Kyiv and its surrounding defensive belt, aiming to isolate the city from eastern reinforcements. Propaganda accompanied these preparations on both sides. German communiques emphasized the progressive tightening of the ring around what they described as the last Soviet stronghold west of the Dnieper. Soviet broadcasts and press statements highlighted the resilience of Kyiv's defenders and the successful repulsion of German reconnaissance attacks. These messaging efforts reflected not battlefield realities, but the psychological dimension of a confrontation, increasingly defined by the conflict between strategic necessity and political symbolism. By mid-August 1941, the operational conditions around Kyiv were defined by an unstable equilibrium. German forces had not yet committed to a full encirclement, but were positioning for it. Soviet forces remained heavily concentrated in and around the city, but faced eroding logistics and limited mobility. The next phase would transform this strategic standoff into a direct clash along the defensive perimeter of Kyiv itself. The first large-scale clashes along the Kyiv defensive perimeter began in the second half of August 1941 as German forces shifted from probing operations to sustained pressure against the outer belt of Soviet fortifications. The Kyiv fortified region, constructed primarily between 1929 and 1935, consisted of more than 200 reinforced concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, and interconnected trench systems arranged in several defensive arcs west and northwest of the city. These positions were originally designed to resist a Polish advance and had not been fully modernized by 1941, but they still provided significant protection to the defending infantry. On 17th and 18th August, elements of the German Sixth Army initiated coordinated attacks against Soviet forward defenses along the Irpin River line. Infantry divisions supported by heavy artillery attempted to force crossings at multiple points near Demivka and Hostomel. German engineers constructed temporary bridges under fire, while artillery batteries delivered concentrated bombardments against Soviet bunker apertures. Several bridgeheads were established, but Soviet rifle divisions supported by fixed artillery from the fortified region prevented a breakthrough into operational depth. German losses during these first assault attempts reached approximately 1,200 killed and wounded over 4 days of fighting. Soviet losses in the same sector are estimated at 2,500 to 3,000 casualties. South of Kyiv, the German 17th Army advanced toward the Dnieper bend near Kyiv and Rzhivchiv, aiming to widen pressure along the river line and threaten Soviet lateral communications. These advances forced the Soviet 26th Army to conduct controlled withdrawals from exposed salients on the western bank of the river. Several river crossings were destroyed by Soviet engineers during these movements, temporarily slowing German pursuit but not altering the broader operational balance. Inside Kyiv, military and civilian mobilization reached full scale. Approximately 160,000 civilians were conscripted for defensive labor between 10 and 25 August. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, road barriers, and fieldworks were constructed throughout the western suburbs. Industrial evacuation intensified. By the end of August, more than 300 major industrial plants and workshops had been dismantled and transferred eastward by rail. Rolling stock congestion reached critical levels as evacuation trains, ammunition supplies, and troop transports competed for limited track capacity. German air pressure escalated further. Between 18 and 31 August, Luftwaffe units conducted more than 900 bombing sorties against Kyiv. Targets included rail yards at Darnitsia, bridge approaches across the Dnieper, power stations, and administrative districts. Civilian casualties during this period exceeded 5,000 killed and wounded, based on post-war Soviet municipal records. Fire control systems in several districts collapsed after repeated strikes against pumping stations and electrical substations. Despite these attacks, Soviet forces maintained cohesion along the primary defensive belt. The Southwestern Front committed reserve rifle divisions and artillery brigades into the Kyiv sector. Between 20 and 28 August, more than 70,000 additional troops were redeployed into the city and its immediate approaches. However, these reinforcements arrived with reduced equipment levels. Many units entered combat with fewer than 60% of authorized artillery and with limited motor transport. On 23 to 24 August, German infantry achieved their deepest penetration of the fortified region west of Kyiv during the summer phase. After a concentrated artillery preparation involving over 400 guns, assault detachments forced temporary breaches near the village of Vita Pochtova. 3 Soviet bunkers were destroyed by direct fire. German units advanced up to 3 kilometers into the defensive zone before being halted by counterattacks from Soviet rifle regiments supported by reserve artillery. The line stabilized again by the morning of 25 August. The civilian presence increasingly affected military movement. Evacuation convoys and defensive construction teams crowded suburban roads already under artillery observation. Medical facilities reached saturation. By the end of August, more than 18,000 wounded military personnel were being treated within the Kyiv urban area. Supplies of anesthetics, blood plasma, and surgical equipment fell below minimum operational reserves. By the final days of August 1941, the direct clash phase around Kyiv had crystallized into a positional battle. German forces had secured footholds west of the outer defensive belt, but had not achieved a decisive breakthrough. Soviet defenders retained control of the main fortified arc and the Dnieper crossings inside the city. The struggle now shifted from initial assaults to a broader operational crisis, driven not only by the fighting at Kyiv itself, but by developments unfolding far to the north and east of the city. By the end of August 1941, the battle for Kyiv entered a phase defined by widening operational crisis rather than localized tactical engagement. Although the German 6th and 17th Armies remained locked in positional fighting along the western approaches to the city, the strategic situation of the southwestern front began to deteriorate rapidly due to developments far beyond the immediate battlefield. The primary driver of this escalation was the German decision to shift major mobile forces from the central axis toward the southern flank of the Eastern Front. On 21 August 1941, Adolf Hitler issued a decisive directive ordering the 2nd Panzer Group under General Heinz Guderian to disengage from Army Group Center and execute a southward thrust behind the northern flank of the southwestern front. This maneuver aimed to achieve a deep operational encirclement of Soviet forces defending Kyiv rather than continuing the direct push toward Moscow. At this point, Guderian's formation consisted of approximately 250,000 men with about 600 operational tanks after losses sustained during the Smolensk campaign. The redeployment began on 23 to 24 August and proceeded rapidly along forest and dirt road corridors through Gomel and Chernigov. Soviet intelligence detected elements of this movement by late August, but initially evaluated it as a limited redeployment rather than a full-scale encirclement maneuver. Reports from partisan groups and aerial reconnaissance indicated increased German traffic along the Desna River corridor, yet front-level command interpreted this primarily as a precaution against Soviet counteroffensives, rather than an immediate strategic threat. As a result, no large-scale withdrawal from Kyiv was authorized. At the same time, German pressure increased along the entire southern front. The 1st Panzer Group continued advancing eastward south of Kyiv, having completed the destruction of Soviet forces near Uman earlier in August. By 25-27 August, elements of the 1st Panzer Group reached the lower Dnieper near Kremenchuk and secured bridgeheads on the eastern bank. This created a southern envelopment arm directly threatening the rear of the Soviet southwestern front. The combination of the southern breakthrough at Kremenchuk and the unseen northern maneuver by Guderian fundamentally altered the operational balance. The Soviet southwestern front now faced the prospect of a double envelopment extending hundreds of kilometers beyond Kyiv itself. Nevertheless, orders from the Soviet State Defense Committee on 27 and 29 August continued to emphasize the necessity of holding Kyiv and the Dnieper line. Marshal Budyani repeatedly warned that the front risked encirclement, but his proposals for a controlled withdrawal were rejected at the highest political level. Logistical conditions inside the Kyiv sector worsened sharply during this period. German air sorties against eastern rail corridors intensified. Between 25 August and 3 September, more than 150 German bombing raids struck rail nodes at Poltava, Grebinka, and Lubny. Ammunition deliveries to the Kyiv defensive zone fell by approximately 35%. Fuel deliveries dropped to less than 50% of daily operational requirements. Several artillery formations reported that available stocks permitted only one major defensive fire mission per day. Soviet manpower losses continued to accumulate. Between 20 August and 5 September, the Southwestern Front recorded approximately 85,000 killed and wounded across all sectors, including Kyiv, Chernihiv, and the southern Dnieper Bend. German losses in the same period across the southern group are estimated at approximately 22,000 killed and wounded. Although numerically smaller, these German losses further strained infantry formations that had been continuously engaged since June. Civilian conditions inside Kyiv entered a new stage of instability. Food stocks in municipal depots declined rapidly due to disrupted supply lines from the east. Ration levels were reduced twice between 25 August and 2 September. Electric power outages became frequent after repeated attacks on substations. By early September, more than 250,000 civilians had been evacuated eastward, but over 600,000 remained within the city during the deepening operational crisis. By the first week of September 1941, the escalation phase was complete. German mobile forces were now approaching the northern and southern rear of the Southwestern Front. Soviet forces remained concentrated around Kyiv under standing orders to hold the city. Operational maneuver was giving way to strategic entrapment, even though the full shape of the encirclement had not yet become visible to most frontline formations. By early September 1941, the operational situation of the Southwestern Front reached the phase of maximum severity. The converging movements of the German 2nd Panzer Group from the north and the 1st Panzer Group from the south began to define the decisive geometry of the future encirclement. On 5 September, Guderian's forward elements crossed the Desna River near Novgorod-Seversky after brief engagements with Soviet covering units. Within 4 days, these formations advanced more than 120 kilometers southward, capturing Konotop on 9 September and severing one of the principal lateral supply routes linking the northern formations of the Southwestern Front with its central reserves. At the same time, the 1st Panzer Group expanded its bridgehead east of the Dnieper near Kremenchuk. Between 6 and 10 September, German engineers completed several heavy pontoon crossings while infantry and artillery secured the flanks. German armored columns advanced northward from the Kremenchuk bridgehead at average rates of 20 to 25 kilometers per day, encountering only fragmented Soviet resistance. Soviet 38th Army units attempted to contain this advance with limited artillery support, but shortages of fuel and ammunition prevented sustained engagement. The Soviet High Command continued to issue orders to hold Kyiv and the Dnieper line. On 7 September, Stavka Directive reaffirmed that the city was not to be surrendered. At this stage, the Southwestern Front still contained approximately 620,000 to 650,000 troops across its armies, including the 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th, and 38th Armies. However, the operational depth behind these forces had largely collapsed. Rail communication with the eastern rear was functioning intermittently, while road transport faced constant air interdiction. German air activity intensified to suppress Soviet attempts at maneuver. Between 5 and 12 in September, Luftwaffe units flew more than 1,500 sorties over the corridors between Kyiv, Poltava, and the Desna crossings. These attacks focused on artillery convoys, pontoon bridge sites, and troop columns attempting to reposition. Soviet losses from airstrikes during this single week are estimated at 18,000 to 22,000 killed and wounded. German air losses during the same period amounted to fewer than 120 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. On 11 September, the forward elements of the German 2nd Panzer Group reached the outskirts of Lokhvitsa, approximately 180 kilometers east of Kyiv. Simultaneously, motorized units of the 1st Panzer Group advanced northward toward the same road junction. The Soviet Southwestern Front now faced the imminent closure of the encirclement hundreds of kilometers behind the Kyiv defensive perimeter. Despite this threat, no order for general withdrawal was issued to the armies defending the city. Conditions inside Kyiv deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition stocks for heavy artillery were reduced to less than 3 days of intensive defensive fire. Fuel reserves for motor transport fell below 30% of minimum requirements. Medical evacuation capacity collapsed as rail routes to the east were cut or bombed. By 10 September, military hospitals in the city were treating more than 45,000 wounded personnel, far exceeding designed capacity. Civilians experienced accelerating disruption. Food ration distribution was reduced again on 8 September. Electricity supply became irregular as transmission lines were repeatedly damaged. Firefighting capability declined after the destruction of several pumping stations. Evacuation ceased almost entirely as rail capacity was redirected toward military transport, though this effort was largely ineffective under air attack. By mid-September 1941, the peak phase of the campaign was no longer defined by fighting directly at the fortified perimeter west of Kyiv. The decisive action had shifted to the deep rear of the Soviet front, where German mobile forces were completing the final approach toward a junction that would cut off all remaining eastward withdrawal routes. The fate of the forces defending Kyiv was now being determined far beyond the city itself. The transition into the resistance and adaptation phase unfolded between 13 and 16 September 1941 as the Soviet Southwestern Front attempted to respond to the rapidly closing encirclement with improvised countermeasures rather than coordinated maneuver. With German armored forces operating deep in the rear, the original concept of defending Kyiv as a fixed strongpoint lost its operational foundation. Soviet adaptation now took the form of fragmented counterattacks, emergency reorganization, and attempts to restore broken command links under constant air and ground pressure. On 13 September, elements of the Soviet 38th and 40th Armies launched localized counterattacks south of the Desna in an effort to disrupt the advance of Guderian's formations toward Lochvitsa. These actions involved fewer than 120 operational tanks and approximately 35,000 infantry drawn from depleted rifle divisions. The attacks achieved limited tactical results, forcing short German delays at several river crossings, but failed to alter the overall momentum. German anti-tank artillery and airstrikes eliminated more than 60 Soviet tanks during these engagements, and infantry losses exceeded 6,000 killed and wounded within 48 hours. Inside the Kyiv sector itself, Soviet defenders increasingly adapted to isolation conditions rather than preparing for coordinated retreat. Artillery units dismantled damaged weapons to redistribute usable components. Engineers repurposed civilian construction materials for bunker reinforcement and street barricades. Communication troops attempted to restore radio contact with neighboring armies using portable transmitters powered by vehicle batteries. Even so, stable command connectivity could not be maintained beyond short intervals due to German jamming and physical destruction of relay nodes. German forces adapted as well. The rapid movement of panzer formations far beyond infantry support forced a shift from classic breakthrough tactics to corridor security operations. Motorized infantry and security regiments were assigned to protect road junctions at Pryluki, Romny, and Lubny, which had become essential arteries for the encirclement. German units constructed layered blocking positions consisting of anti-tank ditches, field strongpoints, and mobile patrol zones. Soviet forces continued to fight with high numerical strength inside the forming pocket, but their ability to influence the broader strategic situation had been lost. Adaptation now occurred at the unit and individual level rather than through coordinated front-level maneuver. The structural conditions for the final encirclement were complete. The turning point of the Kyiv campaign occurred on 16 to 18 September 1941, when the German 2nd Panzer Group advancing from the north and the 1st Panzer Group advancing from the south completed the operational encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front. On the afternoon of 16 September, forward elements of the German 3rd and 16th Panzer Divisions established contact near the town of Lochvitsa, approximately 190 kilometers east of Kyiv. With this junction, all primary rail and road withdrawal routes available to the Soviet forces defending Kyiv and the lower Desna sector were cut. The encirclement now encompassed an area of approximately 40,000 square kilometers. Inside the pocket, the Soviet Southwestern Front included the bulk of 5 field armies: the 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th, and 38th Armies. At the moment of closure, These forces numbered between 600,000 and 650,000 personnel, according to German estimates, with several thousand artillery pieces and several hundred remaining tanks, though fuel and ammunition stocks were critically depleted. The closure of the ring transformed the operational situation from a contested defensive battle into a strategic catastrophe defined by isolation. On 17 September, Stavka finally authorized a general withdrawal from Kyiv, reversing earlier political directives to hold the city at all costs. This order arrived too late to alter the operational outcome. With the encirclement already sealed, no continuous eastward escape corridor existed. Fewer than 15,000 succeeded in passing beyond the outer blocking line. Simultaneously, German 6th Army and 17th Army forces intensified pressure against Kyiv from the west and south. On 18 September, German infantry entered the western suburbs after Soviet rearguards began withdrawing across the Dnieper. Soviet engineers destroyed most remaining bridges behind retreating units. However, the bulk of the 37th Army, responsible for the direct defense of Kyiv, was unable to break out before the encirclement tightened. On 19 September 1941, German troops formally occupied Kyiv. The city fell largely intact from a military infrastructure perspective, though factories, power plants, and port installations had been sabotaged or evacuated in advance. Approximately 200,000 Soviet troops were captured in the immediate Kyiv area during the first 4 days following occupation. Food distribution during the first days of captivity was irregular and insufficient. German field rations provided to prisoners averaged below 300 calories per day. Water access depended on surface wells, rivers, and rainwater collection. Medical treatment for the wounded was minimal. Mortality among prisoners increased rapidly. Post-war Soviet estimates indicate that between 25,000 and 30,000 prisoners died within the first 2 weeks after capture due to untreated wounds, dehydration, exhaustion, and disease. Dysentery and typhus spread quickly under early autumn conditions. German rear area medical detachments conducted only limited quarantine measures, largely due to logistical constraints and prioritization of frontline medical needs. The forced transfer of prisoners toward permanent camps in occupied Ukraine and Poland began almost immediately. Rail transport capacity proved insufficient, forcing the majority of prisoners to march on foot distances ranging from 80 to 160 kilometers. Daily march rates averaged 18 to 25 kilometers. Thousands of prisoners collapsed along the routes and were left behind. German security records classify these losses as non-combat attrition events. In parallel with the prisoner evacuations, the German military administration imposed occupation control over Kyiv and surrounding districts. On 20 September, movement restrictions were introduced for the civilian population. Curfews were enforced, and all residents were required to register with occupation authorities. Food requisition orders were issued to restore supplies for German units advancing east. Large stocks of grain, livestock, and industrial materials evacuated earlier by Soviet authorities were seized if located. Security operations continued through late September and early October to intercept remaining Soviet escape groups. German patrol logs record the capture of an additional 15,000 to 20,000 Soviet soldiers during this period. Partisan-style resistance remained limited and uncoordinated at this stage. German casualties from rear area security operations in the Kyiv region during October 1941 remained below 200 personnel. By early October 1941, all organized resistance inside the former Kyiv encirclement had ceased. The battlefield phase had fully transitioned into post-operational consequences: mass captivity, population displacement, systematic occupation control, and the irreversible institutional destruction of the Southwestern Front as a coherent military formation. The encirclement and destruction of the Soviet Southwestern Front at Kyiv in September 1941 stands as one of the largest operational defeats in military history. Between June and late September, the Soviet forces engaged in the Kyiv defensive operation lost an estimated 600,000 to 665,000 personnel killed, wounded, or captured. German records list approximately 452,000 prisoners taken in the Kyiv encirclement alone, while additional Soviet casualties occurred during earlier defensive phases west of the city. German and Allied losses during the entire Kyiv campaign, from June through September, are estimated at approximately 40,000 to 60,000 killed and wounded across Army Group South and supporting formations. From a strategic standpoint, the destruction of 5 Soviet field armies fundamentally altered the balance of forces on the southern sector of the Eastern Front. With the Southwestern Front eliminated, the German army gained direct access to eastern Ukraine and secured the southern flank of Army Group Center for the final phase of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The victory enabled a rapid German advance toward Kharkiv, the Donbass industrial region, and ultimately Rostov-on-Don by November. It also removed any immediate Soviet capability to conduct large-scale counteroffensives in southern Ukraine during the remainder of the year. The Kyiv encirclement had a direct operational connection to the later German advance into the Caucasus in 1942. By removing Soviet field forces west of the Dnieper and destroying major reserve formations, the Wehrmacht secured the operational conditions that made the 1942 summer offensive toward the Volga and Caucasus possible. The absence of a restored Soviet front in Ukraine after September 1941 forced the Red Army to reconstruct defensive lines hundreds of kilometers to the east under emergency conditions. For the Soviet military system, Kyiv 1941 became a defining case study in the consequences of rigid political directives overriding operational reality. The refusal to authorize timely withdrawal, despite clear evidence of deep German mobile maneuver, resulted in the largest single encirclement of Soviet forces during the war. After 1941, Soviet operational doctrine gradually shifted toward greater emphasis on elastic defense, mobile reserves, and the avoidance of large forward concentrations without secured flanks. These doctrinal adjustments became visible during later defensive operations in 1942 and in counteroffensives from 1943 onward. The fate of senior Soviet commanders captured at Kyiv reflected the political consequences of defeat. General Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, was killed during an attempted breakout on 20 September 1941. Several Army commanders and staff officers were taken prisoner. Some were later executed after repatriation under charges related to surrender and loss of command. Others remained in captivity until the end of the war. These outcomes reinforced a system in which operational failure carried long-term political punishment independent of battlefield conditions. For Kyiv itself, the aftermath of the battle marked the beginning of a prolonged and destructive occupation. Systematic German security operations began immediately after the city's capture. In late September 1941, mass executions of the Jewish population at Babi Yar resulted in the killing of more than 33,000 civilians in 2 days, followed by additional massacres in subsequent months. Forced labor deportations affected tens of thousands of residents. By the time Soviet forces recaptured Kyiv in November 1943, the city had lost a substantial portion of its pre-war population and industrial base. In German military analysis during the war, the Kyiv encirclement was assessed as the largest single operational success of Operation Barbarossa. It reinforced confidence in mobile encirclement warfare and shaped subsequent German planning priorities through the end of 1941. However, the resources committed to the Kyiv operation also delayed the final German drive on Moscow and contributed to the timing constraints that later affected the outcome of the Battle of Moscow. In post-war historiography, Kyiv 1941 occupies a complex position. In Soviet historical writing for decades, the catastrophe was partially obscured or framed in generalized terms of heroic defense. Only after the opening of archival records in the late 20th century did the full operational scale of the encirclement become accessible to systematic study. Today, the Kyiv encirclement is recognized as a decisive example of early war German operational superiority combined with Soviet command rigidity and structural vulnerability. Kyiv, 1941, was not only the destruction of a front, it was the loss of an entire strategic region, the capture of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the transformation of Ukraine into a central battlefield of occupation and annihilation. Its consequences shaped the remainder of the war in the South and remain one of the defining operational disasters of the Second World War.